The night was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner in my car, a monotonous drone that barely covered the pounding of my heart. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the dense woods, where shadows seemed to whisper secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight everything felt different, charged, almost electric, with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of night that clung to your skin, thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. I rolled down the window, hoping for a breath of fresh air, but was met with a gust of something foul, something that reeked of rot. I quickly rolled it back up, my fingers trembling slightly as I did. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 11:11 p.m. A chill ran down my spine. It was the time she used to text me, a habit that started as a coincidence and quickly became an unsettling ritual. Every night, like clockwork, I would receive the same message, thinking of you. But it had been months since I last heard from Emily. Emily. Her name alone brought a flood of memories, each one tinged with a bitterness that I could taste at the back of my throat. We had been so close once, but things changed, I changed, or maybe it was her. The lines blurred over time until I couldn't tell where she ended and I began. Our relationship had always been intense, almost suffocating in its passion, but there was something more to it, a darkness that crept in, poisoning us from the inside out. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but they clung to me like a second skin. The further I drove, the deeper the memories dug in, clawing at the walls of my mind. I hadn't heard from her since the night of the fight that ended everything, the fight that drove me to take this very road in a desperate attempt to escape the toxic hold she had on me. But tonight, something pulled me back. I didn't want to come this way, didn't want to revisit the past, but it was as if some unseen force was guiding my hand, compelling me to return to the place where it all began. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles white in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I was heading toward the cabin, our cabin, the place where everything fell apart. As the car rounded a bend, the trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows that danced along the road. My mind began to race, each bump and creak of the car amplifying the growing sense of dread in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something, or someone, was watching me. Finally, the cabin came into view, its outline barely discernible against the inky blackness of the night. The place had always looked foreboding, even in daylight, but now it was something else entirely. It was as if the cabin had absorbed all the malevolence of the past, turning it into a living, breathing entity that pulsed with an evil of its own. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the void, and the front door stood ajar, swaying slightly in the wind as if beckoning me inside. I killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the cabin, my heart thudding in my chest like a drum. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get back in the car and drive away, but my body refused to move. I was drawn to the place, tethered by some invisible thread that refused to let go. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot like bones snapping. The air was even thicker here, almost choking in its intensity. I could taste it on my tongue, a metallic tang that reminded me of blood. Each step toward the cabin felt like a descent into madness, the distance between me and the front door shrinking and stretching in a sickening, disorienting way. When I reached the porch, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, sending a jolt through my fingertips. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The cabin was just as I remembered it, dim, claustrophobic, and reeking of mildew. But there was something else now, a presence that hung heavy in the air, almost palpable in its intensity. The living room was untouched, as if frozen in time. The same threadbare rug lay before the fireplace, the same worn-out armchair angled toward the window, and on the mantel, the same photos. Us, smiling, happy, before everything turned sour. But as I moved further into the room, I noticed something new. A smell, a rancid, putrid stench that made my stomach churn. It was coming from the kitchen. I approached cautiously, every muscle in my body tense. The smell grew stronger with each step, assaulting my senses until I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. When I reached the doorway, I hesitated, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. I didn't want to face whatever horror was lurking in that room. But I had no choice. Something compelled me to look, to confront the source of that stench. With a shaky hand, I flicked the light switch, and the room was bathed in a sickly yellow glow. There on the kitchen floor was Emily. Her body was twisted in a grotesque, unnatural way, limbs splayed out like a broken doll. Her eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling in an expression of pure terror. But it wasn't the sight of her that made me stumble back in horror. It was the state of her body. Her skin was blackened, bloated, as if she had been left to rot for days, weeks even. But that was impossible. I had just seen her that night. We had fought, screamed at each other, but she was alive when I left. Wasn't she? My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some twisted hallucination, a product of my guilt and fear. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving her body until I hit the wall behind me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as the reality of the situation began to sink in. And then, as if in response to my growing terror, I heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath of wind, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. It was a voice, soft and sinister, calling my name. David! The sound of it made my blood run cold. It was Emily's voice, but distorted, twisted into something unrecognizable. David! Why did you leave me? The voice was closer now, filling the room, echoing off the walls. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice was inside my head, worming its way into my thoughts, poisoning my mind with its venomous words. You did this to me, David! You killed me! I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat like a wounded animal, but it did nothing to stop the voice. It only grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the smell of decay and death. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I could only feel the suffocating weight of my guilt crushing me from the inside out. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, an oppressive void that filled the room with a suffocating sense of dread. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could gather my thoughts, I heard something else, a sound that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere upstairs. I looked toward the staircase, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing through the cabin like a death knell. I tried to move, tried to get up and run, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear as the footsteps continued to descend, closer and closer. And then from the shadows at the top of the stairs, I saw her. Emily, or what was left of her. Her figure was a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light, but I could see enough to know that something was horribly wrong. Her body was twisted, contorted in a way that no human should be able to move. Her head hung at an unnatural angle, and her eyes were empty, void of any life, filled only with a darkness that seemed to swallow the light around her. David, she whispered, her voice echoing through the cabin, seeping into my bones. You can't leave me. You belong to me. And as she took another step toward me, I knew with a sickening certainty that she was right. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming at my body to move, to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in quicksand. Emily, or the thing that wore her face, took another step down the stairs, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if something else was pulling the strings, forcing her forward. I stumbled backward, knocking into the edge of the kitchen table, sending a chair crashing to the floor. The noise was deafening in the heavy silence, and for a brief moment, I thought it might snap me out of this nightmare, that I might wake up in my bed, drenched in sweat but safe. But the harsh reality refused to let go, clinging to me with icy fingers. Emily's gaze never left mine as she continued her descent, those hollow eyes drilling into me with a malevolence that made my skin crawl. Each step she took was accompanied by a sickening creak of the old wood beneath her, as if the cabin itself was groaning in pain, in fear. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine, soaking into my shirt. I had to get out. I had to escape before she reached me. But as I turned to make a dash for the door, I heard a low, guttural growl that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was coming from behind me, from the kitchen where Emily's rotting corpse still lay sprawled on the floor. Slowly, with a heart pounding so hard it hurt, I turned back toward the kitchen. The sight that greeted me was impossible, defying all logic, all sanity. Emily's body, the one that had been lying lifeless just moments ago, was now moving. Her limbs twitched and convulsed, bones snapping and cracking as they bent at grotesque angles. Her head lolled to the side, those dead eyes now locked onto me with a hunger that made my stomach lurch. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the fallen chair as I tried to keep my distance from the horror unfolding before me. But it was no use. Emily's body was pulling itself upright, a marionette controlled by some unseen force, strings of blackened veins bulging beneath her skin as she moved. Her mouth opened, and a wet, rasping breath escaped, filling the room with the stench of decay. "You can't escape, David." The voice was no longer just in my head. It reverberated through the cabin, a chorus of distorted echoes that made the walls tremble. It was coming from both versions of Emily now, the one on the stairs and the one in the kitchen, their voices overlapping in a nightmarish symphony. "You can't run from what you've done, from what you are." I was trapped, surrounded by these two twisted manifestations of the woman I once loved. The air grew thick with a suffocating miasma, the smell of rot and something far worse, something toxic, seeping into my lungs, into my very soul. My vision blurred, and I could feel the edges of my consciousness fraying, as if I was being pulled into a dark, bottomless pit. But I couldn't give in. I couldn't let them take me. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I forced my legs to move, pushing past the table and rushing toward the front door. My fingers fumbled with the handle, slick with sweat. But finally the door swung open, and I burst out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, shocking me back to my senses. I didn't dare look back as I sprinted toward the car, the gravel crunching under my feet like the bones of some long-forgotten creature. The forest loomed around me, dark and silent, a maze of shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. My only thought was to get as far away from the cabin as possible, to put miles between me and that thing that wore Emily's face. I reached the car, my hands shaking so violently that it took me several tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I threw the car into gear and tore down the driveway, the tires skidding on the loose gravel. The road ahead was a blur, the trees whipping past in a dark smear as I drove faster and faster, desperate to outrun the terror that clung to me like a second skin. But even as I sped away from the cabin, I couldn't escape the voice. It was still there, in the back of my mind, whispering insidiously, planting seeds of doubt and fear. "You can't run from yourself, David. You belong to me." I shook my head, trying to dislodge the voice, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The memories of that night, the fight, came rushing back, each one more vivid and painful than the last. I had left her there, alone in that cabin, left her to face whatever darkness had taken root. And now, that darkness had found me. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the woods, and I began to realize with growing horror that I didn't recognize where I was. This wasn't the way back to town. This wasn't the way to safety. The trees closed in around me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to pull me into their embrace. I tried to slow down, to find my bearings, but the car seemed to have a mind of its own, the steering wheel fighting against my grip. The headlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the road, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw her again. Emily standing in the middle of the road, her twisted form illuminated by the pale beams of light. I swerved, barely missing her, the car skidding off the road and into the trees. The impact was jarring, the crunch of metal and the shattering of glass filling the air. I was thrown forward, the seatbelt digging into my chest, knocking the wind out of me. Everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The engine had died, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but my head was pounding, a dull, throbbing pain that made it hard to think. I looked around trying to get my bearings. The car was a wreck, crumpled against a tree, the windshield shattered, shards of glass glittering in the moonlight. I tasted blood, felt it trickling down the side of my face, but it was the least of my concerns. Because standing just outside the broken window was Emily. She was whole again, no longer twisted or grotesque, but just as I remembered her. Beautiful, with long dark hair and eyes that once held warmth. But now those eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. "You can't run, David," she whispered, her voice soft but carrying the weight of inevitability. "You can't hide from the truth." I tried to move, to escape, but my body was sluggish, the pain making every movement agonizing. Emily reached through the shattered window, her hand brushing against my cheek. It was cold, so cold, and her touch sent a shiver down my spine. "You did this to me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the night like a knife. "You poisoned us, David. You poisoned me." Tears welled up in my eyes, the weight of her words crushing me, suffocating me. She was right. I had done this. I had let the darkness consume us, had let the toxicity of our relationship fester until there was nothing left but rot, and now there was no escape. "It's time to come home, David," she said, her voice gentle, almost kind. "It's time to be with me again." She leaned closer, her lips brushing against my ear, and I could feel her breath, cold and lifeless, sending another wave of chills through me. Together, forever. And as the darkness closed in, as the pain and fear slipped away, I finally understood. There was no running from this. No running from her, from us. The toxic bond that had tied us together in life had followed us into death, and now there was no escape. The last thing I saw before the world faded away was Emily's face, smiling softly as she pulled me into the abyss.